Hello and welcome to Sweet Sycamore. Today we are on episode 11 as we start chapter 6 of the book of Esther. Now, where we left off at the end of chapter 5, Haman has just come from a banquet with Esther and King Xerxes, and Esther invites him to a second banquet. So he is leaving this banquet feeling like he is on cloud nine, that he is the somebody of all somebodies. And then he sees Mordecai sitting by the palace gate. He's not bowing. He's not standing. He's not in reverence to Haman. And Haman gets furious and it ruins his great day. He goes home and he gathers his friends and his family and he shares all his accolades and how they're worth nothing because Mordecai does not fear him. And so what does Haman do? He spends his evening, or at least hires it out that evening, to construct a 75-foot pole with the intention of impaling Mordecai on in the morning. But he can't do so without the king's permission. Could you imagine waking up in the morning and looking outside your window and seeing a 75-foot pole sticking out of the ground, knowing what those are for? They were intended to impale people, and people going, "Who is this for? What is this for?" And simply hearing Mordecai. Could you imagine Mordecai knowing that this was for him? And the confidence that Haman feels with his power, that no matter what, he can probably get Mordecai on that pole. Not even like saying days from now. He's saying, I want it done this morning. So how is Mordecai feeling through all this? I mean, not only does he already have a death date, I mean, Haman has already worked with the king to finalize this date that all the Jews are supposed to be killed. But now it's not looking like it's months down the road. Now it's looking like it's hours. It's like when people say, smile, it could get worse. And then you smile and then things actually do get worse. I mean, this is what it's like for Mordecai. If King Xerxes gave permission for Haman to kill an entire people group, with, by the way, without even asking which people group it was, why would he bat an eye at just one person that Haman could easily say was part of that people group? Why would he care if one person died early, if one person set an example for what was to come? I mean, this is why Mordecai is literally sitting in a pile of disaster. Darkness is getting darker. And I have been there in my life. I have been there where I'm like, things can't get worse. And then you're like, why did I even say that? Things just got worse. And I imagine this is what Mordecai is feeling in this moment. Or maybe he's thinking, like, I had it coming. He never acknowledged God as his God. I mean, he was hiding his identity as a Jewish man. He was encouraging Esther to hide who she was. Esther had two names. She had her Jewish name and then her Persian name so she could hide who she was. And this was all by the help of Mordecai, who raised her. He was like a believer in God, but he was a secret believer. He was a secret service agent for God. He was hiding who he really was. And maybe he even thought, I have this coming. I mean, why would God come to my rescue now? But here's one thing that I know about God. We can choose to not acknowledge his existence. But to God, our existence is everything. Just because we choose to ignore him does not mean that he disappears. We can choose to not love him. It does not stop him from loving us. We can choose to not identify with him. It does not stop God from desiring to identify with us. All of these things, how we live our life, does not make God not exist, does not make God stop loving us, does not make him stop caring about his kids. And we see this with God right here in the book of Esther. Esther's not even mentioned in the entire passage of chapter 6. And Mordecai is kind of like a subplot here in chapter 6 because there is a main character that is coming on the scene in chapter 6. And that is God himself. And I'm so excited as we dig into this because God is going to work when things are the darkest. Because, by the way, darkness does not scare him. In fact, darkness just shows people how much light he can truly bring. And that's what we see in verse 1. In chapter 6, it says, "That night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so that it could be read to him." He couldn't sleep. It doesn't say why, he just couldn't sleep. But why do we think he can't sleep? It's that but God moment. God is waking King Xerxes up. God can keep us up. And he is not only keeping Xerxes up, he is actually directing his activity. He has a sudden urge to read the accounts of his reign. Now, I need us to know this isn't like picking up a great book with a riveting story that you cannot wait to see what the ending is. This is not what this kind of reading is. This is like reading someone's income tax returns. This is like, so-and-so did this, so-and-so came to you for this, this is what you did. I mean, it is like read to him, probably monotone voice. This is being read probably with the purpose of trying to make him go back to sleep. This is boring reading. This is things that King Xerxes already knows. And that is what he's choosing. And not only that, it tells us that he picked the 12th year. In other words, it's like going to the shelf and like randomly selecting a book from the middle. This would have been about 5 years previous to him. So this was 5 years ago that he's like, yeah, let's just see what happened 5 years ago. It's not long enough where I'd actually forget, so maybe it'll be so boring I'll actually sleep. Yet all of a sudden, it's like he was jolted fully awake, because verse 2 says, "In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters." This would be very trusted individuals. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. Verse 3, "What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this?" the king asked. And his attendants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." See, Persian kings were famous for their diligence in making sure that they rewarded those who assisted them, especially those that would go on to save their life. Because not only would this be good public relations for these people, but it also kept them safer in an environment where kings would be overthrown by predecessors very easily. And 5 years has gone by, and they have done nothing for Mordecai. Now, Mordecai would know that the king would normally do something. And we spoke about this in a previous podcast, how he would probably be anticipating King Xerxes doing something for him because he saved his life, yet nothing happened. And 5 years has gone by, so he is thinking this is completely forgotten at this point. But let me tell you, if something would have happened back then, nothing would be happening now, okay? And we need to understand that, because I think sometimes in my own life, I am waiting for a blessing that should be coming now. Lord, I did this for you, so where's the blessing? God's blessings always come through. He is always faithful with his blessings. However, they do not always come through in my timeline. Have you ever felt justified, like deserving of something that didn't come through in the moment you felt like you deserved it? Or maybe you even justified that it didn't come through because maybe you really didn't deserve it. And perhaps even Mordecai could have thought the same thing. Well, I didn't deserve the blessing because look where I'm at with my walk with the Lord. Look how I haven't lived my life the way I'm supposed to for him. But God is not done with this story and even with this blessing. Because here stands King Xerxes with probably the thought of who will save my life next time if there's no certainty of reward. And we see that King Xerxes is a very impulsive man. We see that when he quickly gets rid of Queen Vashti. We see that when he signs this edict to kill all of the Jews. And so I can imagine him jumping out of bed very quickly, striding out of that royal bedchamber in the early morning, and people just trailing after him, thinking, why is he up so early? What are we doing? But him thinking, I have to rectify this now. But remember, King Xerxes is not very good at making decisions without his advisors. We see that with Queen Vashti. We see this over and over, that he only goes on the decisions of others. He is constantly counting on others to tell him what to do. So now it doesn't surprise me that he's basically looking around and saying, who are any of my advisors that can tell me what to do in this moment? And so that's where we jump to verse 4, where it says, the king asks, "Who is in the outer court?" the king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the servants replied to the king, "Haman is out in the court." I love the scriptures when they say things as it happened. Haman had just arrived as it happened. We all know that this is not an as it happened moment, that this is God. He is aligning this. Now, you remember why Haman was there so early, right? He was there to speak to the king about killing Mordecai. I mean, Haman had so much power, but even he could not kill somebody without the king's permission. And here was God moving all these pieces into play. Haman's anger was out of control. We spoke about that in chapter 5. His pride was on like level 1 million. And because of that, he was so angry with Mordecai that he's going to spend all night constructing this pole while God is keeping King Xerxes up and putting Mordecai on the brain of King Xerxes. And here is Haman in the early hours of the morning, standing in the outer court, waiting to speak with the king in order to ask permission to kill Mordecai. I mean, he could not even enjoy his day. He could not enjoy this next dinner with Esther and the king with Mordecai alive. And King Xerxes, when he finds out Haman is in the court, he says, "Bring him in." So Haman came in, and the king said, "What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" I'm just imagining Haman in this court. You see, everybody had to be summoned to come before the king. Everybody. It wasn't just for Esther that you couldn't come before the king unsummoned. Haman too. He was part of that also. So when he gets the private invitation in the early morning hours and literally hears the king say, "Bring him in," when the king should still be sleeping, Haman has to look at this as the perfect opportunity, that all the stars are aligning for him. But then to hear the king's words of what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? I mean, who would please the king more than Haman? He is the right-hand man to the king. He is chosen in that position. He is the only one invited to these 2 private dinners with the king and the queen. Who else could he be talking about? And remember, Haman's pride and how he thinks about himself is in the highest percentage. And so for him, why would there be anybody else but him? So it doesn't surprise me when we continue on with verse 6. It says, "Haman thought to himself, 'Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?' So he replied, 'If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horses. Have the officials shout as they go, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." I mean, Haman has put some thought into this, let's be honest, because when I look at this description that he has just come up with really quickly, I mean, he has been daydreaming about what the best reward would be for him. If you had to dream up your reward, what would it be? I mean, for Haman, it's interesting because it's not really about wealth or power, really, because he already has both of those things. But what was this reward about? You see, this reward, when you are on the king's horses in the king's robes and everybody is talking about the king. I mean, you look at this description and how many times it mentions the king, the king. Just that, it tells me it's not about wealth or power for Haman. He already has those. He wanted to be king. This is him looking like he is the king in public. I mean, this parade would go through the plaza of the city, a place where everyone would see. It was a dream day for Haman to pretend like he was king for a day. That's really what his dream was about. I just get kicks and giggles out of verse 10 because the king looks at Haman and says, "Excellent." And Haman has to be like, oh, what? You know, like that was easy. Like I just got my dream for a day. But then he doesn't stop there. He says, quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. Oh man, could you imagine Haman's face right now? His prime enemy. Interesting enough that the king knows exactly where Mordecai is. He must have been so loyal to always sitting at the gate of the palace. I mean, that is where he heard about this potential threat to the king's life. And that is where Haman has just left him the night before, sitting there. And so this is a place where Mordecai is often, and the king knows it. And so he says, Mordecai, who sits at the gate. I want to make sure we're talking about the same Mordecai. I don't want Haman to switch up a different Mordecai. This is the one. We know we're talking about the same person, and leave out nothing that you have suggested. What has gone on to be Haman's biggest dream is becoming his worst nightmare, as he is the one that is supposed to walk Mordecai around, and he is there for the intention of actually asking the king to kill Mordecai. So his plan is completely squashed at this moment of time. If Mordecai was always sitting at the palace gate, and the king Xerxes tells Haman to go to the palace gate to get Mordecai, I imagine that Mordecai would have already been sitting at the palace gate in those early morning hours as Haman walked through those gates, knowing that he was going to ask permission from the king to kill Mordecai, but Mordecai also knowing the same. He knew his name was on that pole. He knew that was intended for him. And as he watches Haman walk in, he was probably thinking, in the next time he walks out, that's it. I'm done. But see, God was holding off on a blessing for his perfect timing so that the blessing could be exponentially multiplied in this moment of time. A blessing like this would have meant nothing 5 years prior, but a blessing like this in this moment of time was literally going to save Mordecai's life. Going back that God's timing is always better than our timing. God does reveal the hearts of men, and Mordecai isn't demanding this blessing. He wasn't knocking on the door going, why didn't I get my reward? He was waiting patiently on the Lord. And that is why in chapter 6, the main character is really God. God keeps King Xerxes awake. God directs King Xerxes to this 12th book where he can find out about Mordecai. God even uses Haman's pride to get him there in the early morning hours. God is setting all this up. 5 years ago, God helped King Xerxes completely forget about honoring Mordecai, which normally would have been a natural process, and probably even all the people around him just happened to forget. Why? Because God aligned the pieces where he wanted them for his perfect timing. And I really do believe that it's because the glory was not to go to King Xerxes. The glory was not even to go to Mordecai for what he did for King Xerxes. In this moment, Mordecai is going to know that this is not by the hands of man, but this has to be by the hands of God. In all blessings, God wants the glory. And that is why sometimes it will look like it is being withheld till in the darkest moment, it will look like we are sitting under a pile of rubble. Because when we come out from underneath that rubble, we will know it wasn't by our own hands. We will know it wasn't an act of man, but we will know it's from God himself. God is always wanting the glory. The scriptures are not about man. The scriptures are about a God pursuing his kids, pursuing man. And so if you feel like God is withholding from you, I encourage you to wait it out, because even in the moments when you feel like you have failed, God will not fail you. When you have these moments like Mordecai and you turn back to him and you cry out to him, he will always meet you. I cannot wait for our next podcast because we get to see how this actually plays out and maybe even see Haman eat a little piece of humble pie. Until next time, we love you guys. I hope you have gained some insight into the scriptures today. We'll be back next Wednesday with episode 12.